A very good evening to everybody at home. It is 2100 hours Central African time, and I am Tandeka Gubulembeki, and you are watching Economics Unbound. Tonight, we zoom in onto the economy of Zimbabwe.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. We have exciting news for you, dear viewer. Well, from tonight, we will be bringing you 1 hour of business news and economic debates that count, as Economics Unbound will come to you every Thursday between 9 and 10 p.m.
Now, Africa needs 1 million jobs a month, and that's why giant infrastructure projects are so important in transforming the continent. This is one of the sentiments that emerged from a panel discussion on infrastructure where experts shared at the World Economic Forum on Africa. I facilitated the plenary. The focus was on national sovereignty and sustainability. What do you think the big mega projects can do to help us improve employment levels, more even development, and most importantly, how can we begin to collaborate?
Well, we have to look at each country's background. The history of each country contributes to where we are in terms of the level of development, in terms of the acquisition of technology in our respective economies. But at the end of the day, history is the past. We now have to look into the future and to say what must we do for ourselves to improve the lives of our people into the future. In my view, speaking about Southern Africa, SADC in particular, all the member states of SADC have different histories and the size of our economies are different. But it is necessary that we integrate, we talk to each other, we have conversation about how we move forward. It is necessary that I should mention at this stage that the current crop of leadership in Southern Africa, SADC in particular, is now different from the founding fathers of SADC.
The liberation leaders.
Yes, because their task at the time they were seized with the task to liberate our region, that every single country in our region should be independent. So theirs was a political struggle to gain independence, freedom and dignity of our people. But our current crop of leadership have a different task to achieve. It is now economic rather than political. Yes, political because we must deepen our democracy. That is political. But it is necessary that we now grow and modernize our economies. We must be able, as we develop individually, make our economies talk to each other, have a conversation to each other. Now you are talking about major projects in our respective countries. What comes to mind immediately is the major projects that are applicable to the region. Things like energy. We have a deficit of energy in the entire SADC area. So we must look at how we must collectively resolve the issue of energy in Southern Africa or in SADC in particular. That's number one, so that as we move forward, as we modernize energy or electricity is critical to achieve that objective. Then secondly, the issue of infrastructure. Some infrastructure is domestic, that is, it's national. Some infrastructure is regional. If you look at roads, we must have roads that speak to each other. We must have roads that are developed a standard that is acceptable to the entire region in our area. Let us look at our railway infrastructure. Our railway infrastructure was developed separately during the colonial period, but now we must make sure our railway system and networks must speak to each other. We must modernize, we must have a vision as to what we must have in future in relation to our railway system in our respective countries. I think something like of the 15 or 16 countries of SADC, I think 12 of them or so are landlocked. They have no access to the sea.
Like yours, Mr. President.
Yes, like in Zimbabwe. But we must not then bury our heads in the sand and say we are landlocked. We should say, initially, we believe we must say we are land-linked. And how do we get land-linked? We must develop systems to take us to the sea. But down the line, as we cooperate with countries which share the seas, like Mozambique, South Africa, Namibia, we become also sea-linked because we've now developed infrastructure that can look after our goods and services in and out. But to do so, we must have a system where those countries who are landlocked, the cost of their services in and out, goods and services, we must find a way of lessening that burden so that on average, our economy is not to be burdened by the reason that we are landlocked. We must be able to cooperate either by road, by rail, or by air. It is critically important that we do so. So I've talked about energy, which is a deficit in our area. We also now must look at food security. It is critical that in developing countries like Africa, the primary thing we must secure is that as a region we must be food secure. Yes, we don't have the same endowments in regard to agriculture in the region. But I believe that if we modernize and mechanize our agriculture and have a focus as to where we want to reach in relation to making our region food adequate, then we must cooperate in mechanizing our agriculture, in modernizing our agriculture, and having each member state doing the best depending on the advantages they have in terms of agriculture, wildlife, or livestock. That is another area. Then the next thing that follows is that we are also endowed with minerals, but not every member state of SADC has the same number of minerals in the ground. But we should say that in the past, when our founding fathers were concerned about liberation and freedom, political freedom and democracy, we continued to exploit our resources and send them out unprocessed without beneficiating our own materials, our own minerals. But now, under the current leadership, we are agreed that it is necessary that we look at having technology brought into the region to beneficiate our minerals together. At the end of the day, in the past, even the minerals, we had no capacity to be effective in the global market. It is also necessary now that as we develop, as Africa joins the global market, we also in our region must make sure we don't limit ourselves to the level of production, primary production. We must move forward to agro-processing and the beneficiation of our minerals in the country and then participate directly into global markets. This is what I believe we should do in our region. So our task with the current leadership is that we must continuously interrogate what we must do. In my view, we bring in the type of education that must now be in our region. In the past, we were taken to school 50 years ago, 60 years ago, in order to be able to be clerks or nurses. But we are not given education to be innovative for our own needs, to address the challenges which we face and by ourselves develop technologies to attend to the particular challenges which we face as a region. So again, we are now talking to our higher institutions of learning to change the curriculums so that they address and they speak to the type of product we must produce in our institutions in order to develop ourselves. Yes, it is necessary. We cannot invent the wheel, but it is necessary that as we look for technology from outside, we must have it adapted to our own conditions.
Madam Commissioner, the AU has a number of mega projects. Have these translated into increases in GDP in the various areas? What has been the impact of these projects?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on this panel. But let me start on maybe talk about what's happening on the continent and how do we perceive these mega projects. Our aim at the African Union is to create one continent that is peaceful, prosperous, and competing at the global level, as His Excellency Mr. President just said. Now, to do that, and maybe I will focus on infrastructure because this is what I know best, or at least I'm trying to know. Infrastructure, why it's important? The African Union has launched, as you know, for instance, the African Free Trade Area, and it went into effectiveness last July. We're talking about a huge continent made of 55 countries. The population is 1.3 billion people, increasing. This is young and energetic and in need of employment. Thing is, India has almost the same size in terms of population, but it's one country. Now we're talking about 55 fragmented economies. The size of our economies is small and cannot absorb all this potential of young people and cannot create this large number of employment that is needed. Some studies say, and hear me well, that Africa needs 1 million jobs per month. 1 million jobs per month. This is why mega projects are important. We need to make sure that whatever we're going to do, we need this huge space, and that's why we created the African Free Trade Area. We need to trade among each other, but trade in what? Trade in the roots of services. Therefore, we need to industrialize, transform, and so on and so forth. Now, the African Union has created or has worked with the regional economic communities in selecting a number of regional and transcontinental projects in the fields of energy, of transport, of ICT, and when I say transport, that's road, railways, air, and maritime. I wanted to highlight that since we are talking about trade, the cost of transport within the composition of our the cost of export on the continent, 70%. So transport accounts for 70% of the cost of export in Africa. It's 20% elsewhere. And every 1% increase in transport and telecommunication infrastructure on the continent translates into 3% increase in exports. That's why it's important we work on our infrastructure, especially that the infrastructure that we were left off with mainly goes from Africa to the former colonials, but not between African countries. So that's why our program focusing on linking and physically linking the continent together and integrating it.
Which is what the President
exactly, and taking it further. We finished a 10-year program, and by which, you know, thousands of kilometers have been extended, and you're talking about the Cape to Cairo, and not only by road, but also fiber optics, and it's actually done by a Southern African company that is, you know, working on the Cape to Cairo linkage, ICT linkage. So back to that question. We will see the impact in terms of GDP, and we are already seeing, you know, an improved GDP on the continent. Many of our economies, we have at least.
In East Africa.
Actually, even in West Africa, we have 5 or 6 countries now that account among the fastest growing economies in the world. By all accounts, and despite all the challenges we're having on the continent, as a continent, we're still having positive growth rates, and this has been sustained for almost 20 years now. And resilience, not only the growth rate, but the resilience, despite the global shocks that the continent has been witnessing, we have overcome these shocks, and we still continue to have these positive GDPs. However, the challenge is the large number of jobs that are needed on the continent, and the cost of infrastructure is big, is huge. We're talking about the financial needs between 100 and 130 billion by some estimates, and we can only provide a third, maximum half of that as governments with all the competing demands our governments are having. And in addition to all of this, we are also facing a huge challenge of climate. And many of our infrastructure gets wiped away at the next storm, and we've seen this happening, especially in this part of the world, I mean in Southern Africa, and the shocks due to climate are happening in a much more vicious way and more frequently than before. And Africa, which is the less guilty when it comes to climate change, is paying the heaviest price.
Madame Stoffel-Delpret, Deloitte estimates that over the next 10 years, the Africa infrastructure backlog will need to be funded by the tune of about 93 billion per annum. Talk to us about funding.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. I come from a landlocked country as well. We know a thing or two about needing infrastructure to have access to markets and to have a growth perspective. But I also come from a country where we currently live with negative interest rates. If you as a company take out money from a bank, they pay you to take their money. On the other hand, if you as an individual want to save your money and bring it to the bank, you have to pay the bank to take the money. So the huge amounts you just cited that are needed in infrastructure, not just on this continent, but globally to also achieve the development goals that we have all set for ourselves. We need to find a solution, not just to the financing, but we also need to find a solution to having the huge amounts of money that are available to bring them to the projects that need that financing. And we, as a financial market that is one of the largest in the world, and Switzerland is known for having the largest cross-border wealth management sector within its borders, we are very interested in exactly addressing the interface between the money that is there and the need that is so apparent all over the world. And we try to do this I would say at least in two paths that overlap. One is we want to look at the interface and bring our expertise to the table in helping assess risks, credit risks, debt sustainability, for example. Our huge insurance industry has a great part to play in that role. But we're also looking at questions of transparency and, of course, integrity of financial markets. They all need to play a role, and they all need to be brought together by the partners in a bankable project. And we're very much interested in finding maybe prototypes and working also with regional development banks in finding exactly the right recipe of all the needs, as also Mr. President addressed them, to have money flow from where it is to where it is needed, also to the benefit of those who then invest. And I would say the second aspect that we're looking at is the huge chances and the opportunities that are opened, especially in the West already, by the new digital technologies. Switzerland has a regulatory framework that already addresses the challenges of the blockchain technology, and we see how market infrastructure, financial market infrastructures, trading platforms, investment opportunities, advising of customers with regards to investments is already done on platforms, on systems that are easy to handle, that are very accessible, that offer a great degree of transparency and stability and security, and we would already want to bring that dimension also into the mix of helping such projects come to fruition.
Listening to you, one gets the sense of an exciting future for infrastructure, because traditionally on our continent, infrastructure spending has been funded off the balance sheet of our states. And this is set to change now that there are new technologies and new opportunities for cooperation across continents. And that's one of the beauties of this panel, is that it's a multi-continental exercise.
As a private and sector investor, and Agility is one of the world's largest logistics companies operating globally. And from an Africa perspective, I think we are hugely bullish on the African opportunity. A lot of our traditional markets we're seeing are slowing down or stagnating. We think Africa is the place to be investing and putting real capital into providing infrastructure solutions. Now, as a private company, we can't do full infrastructure packages and sort everything. So we're investing in what we see is fundamentally infrastructure aligned with the growth opportunity. So we're building across the continent a network of international standard warehouse parks. Now, on the face of it, that doesn't seem particularly exciting, but the reality is the capability, the warehousing and buildings that are fundamental building blocks to economic growth and prosperity. So we use our warehouses, we invest, we put the capital in, we buy 500,000 square meters. That's about 100 football pitches, to put it into perspective, on the edge of all the major cities in Africa. We build the infrastructure and we invest in it, so it creates a platform that enables trade. And we see it, and I think it aligns with everything everybody said, we see it as a way that manufacturers are able to have an ease of doing business and manufacture locally to meet demand. It's a logistics platform that will support regional trade and the growth with the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, the growth of a market that's 1.3 billion, 2 billion people by the time it's actually up and operational. We think that e-commerce is going to be huge in Africa. So although building warehousing doesn't seem hugely important, the reality is it enables SMEs to grow and develop. An SME can come to us, and we've got examples in our current portfolio where they couldn't raise the money to build premises to expand their operations and meet international standards. For us, they can come in under our SME program, sign a lease, pay a deposit, and get the keys and move in Monday. Likewise, when I look at our 65,000 global customers that we do integrated logistics for, they all want to go to Africa. They all understand the opportunity. They just find it really difficult to execute. So by building an infrastructure capability, a warehouse park, and it's landscaped and it's got consistent power, it's safe and it's secure, it enables companies to say, great, let's go into the Africa marketplace, and it makes the ease of doing business more efficient and much simpler and faster. If I look at Ghana as an example, one of our large blue chip customers, they had an original plan to go into Ghana that they thought would cost them $5 million investment to find a site, build a factory, set it up, start operating, and they thought it would be $5 million and 3 years before they sold any product. Because we'd already built and invested in infrastructure, they were able to come into one of our warehouses, set up their manufacturing plant, so their cost of going into the African market moved from $5 million to $1 million for exactly the same business plan. And instead of selling products in 3 years' time, they were able to start selling products in 3 months. So that's a real enabler, and going back to your point, that's a platform that can create jobs for local companies, can create jobs for multinationals coming into the continent. And I think although we're doing it in a very niche sector, which is in relation to warehousing, the opportunity is as infrastructure gets better, you can trade regionally, you can manufacture and move goods. Instead of just selling in Abidjan and Cote d'Ivoire, you're able to sell across the whole of West Africa. And that's what's going to really stimulate the economic growth.
Well, thanks for that very granular view from the ground. Wong Ai, you come from a country that moved from being a third world country to a first world country at a dizzying speed. And your infrastructure is breathtaking and enviable. What lessons would you like to share?
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be part of this panel, and thank you for your kind words. I think it's easier for a country like Singapore, which is small, to get from point A to point B in 54 years. We just turned 54 last month. A little bit about myself and the organization I represent. I'm from Baker McKenzie. I'm the Asia Pacific Chair. We are a global law firm, and we believe in following our clients. And I have to say, Africa has become extremely interesting. You're seeing interest not just from the Europeans, the Middle East, but increasingly from many countries in the Asia Pacific region. Much has been said about Chinese investments. There have been Korean ones. The Japanese have been here for a long time, and India and Indonesia as well. So initially, as with all countries, you start on the infrastructure first. And that is the development finance funded initially, and then multilaterally through other countries in the region. If you can paint a story or convince with a story that regional integration and connectivity benefits all in the end, you will get a multilateral intra-regional effort. And I think Singapore has piggybacked on that through an organization called ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, to have a louder voice on the global stage to get the funding and the attention that we needed. But infrastructure is just the beginning. And it's very interesting to hear from His Excellency and from Jeffrey and from Mina as well, the Commissioner, about infrastructure being just the foundation stone, right? Because you're not really just looking at infrastructure per se. It's everything else that can build upon what infrastructure enables. Things like trade, not just exports, but intra-regional imports and trade as well, foreign direct investment, education, banking and finance, technology transfers. So I see Africa as being at the beginning of a very exciting story. And perhaps what I'd like to hear from this panel and maybe even the audience is much has been said about multilateral governmental and institutional effort, but there has been a lot of private sector investment into Africa as well, from all over the world, and they're all competing with each other. And the FDI is growing by double digits across the continent. So, it'd be interesting to see, apart from infrastructure, what the African Union and other countries are doing to get together to coordinate and enable their private sector investment. Because I think in the end, that is going to be the engine of growth.
I think they'll have to answer whether the African private sector is growing, and is it growing as fast as it should. But Mr. President, we need to tell a harmonious story, and we need to work on social cohesion. Events in South Africa recently don't bode well for regional cooperation. What can we do to enhance social cohesion and unity in our region? ASEAN was able to tell one story. How can we?
My own belief is that as we aspire to modernize and remove our people from poverty level to middle income levels, we must address certain issues that are necessary to lift the lower strata of our societies, like in the area of housing, the area of clean water, the area of sanitation. These are basic and are local. I would believe that the 5 regions of our continent, in our desire to modernize and so on, we should not forget that it is necessary that we don't leave anybody behind by making sure we address those issues that are domestic, that are at national level. But of course, in the long run, they will relate to the entire region. When you have clean water, you would not want your neighbor to be behind. You need also your neighbor to make sure they address that issue. They focus on making sure the majority of our people have access to clean water, they have access to housing.
Mr. President, if your brother, Cyril Ramaphosa, my president, were to ask you how to deal with xenophobia in the interests of economic cooperation, what would you say, sir?
The issue is a question of understanding, a question of accepting each other. And that comes from how our current governments relate to the people, our political parties. We must preach unity, we must preach love, we must preach that we are one people, we are brothers and sisters. Not only in one single country, but in the region, we must talk about integration so that the mentality of this is mine and it ends there must be removed. We must move away from the past concept of communities being separate. Currently, we are integrated. You have South Africans marrying in Mozambique, Mozambicans marrying in Zimbabwe, Zimbabweans marrying in Botswana, people from Botswana marrying in Namibia, Zambia, and so on. We are getting integrated. So all what is necessary, those things that are happening are a result of failure to bring people to a level where they respect each other. And that can only be done when people have a hope, when people can see that they can progress, when there is a roadmap for progress, a roadmap for moving from the lowest standard. You can see that, okay, 2 years ago, I was at this level, now I'm that level. But if persons remain without hope, feeling depressed, it is easy for these things to happen. So it is my view that we should continuously have a conversation with our people, giving them hope for moving forward and implementing such projects, such programs in society, which lifts the hopes of our people to go forward.
Now that was Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa. After the break, we will be speaking to Zimbabwean Finance Minister Mthuli Ncube. Do not go away, please stay with us.
Welcome back. Well, recently the Zimbabwean Finance Minister Mthuli Ncube wrote an interesting opinion editorial piece in the Financial UK Times on Zimbabwe's currency reform. The minister said introducing a new currency, meaning bringing back the Zimbabwe dollar, was the country's only viable option.
Yes, now, Nana. Ncube went on to say that the multi-currency system, the US dollar, British pound, South African rand, the euro, the Chinese renminbi, and the Botswana pula had become outdated. He said the currency regime was a tourniquet, not a cure. So it was a temporary solution, not a cure. Well, we caught up with Minister Ncube at the World Economic Forum for Africa. This is what he had to say.
We know that in Zimbabwe, the sectors of agriculture and mining are the biggest drivers of growth. What challenges in particular are those two sectors facing at the moment?
Well, agriculture and mining are big drivers, but also there's the services sector, there's also the tourism sector. But just for those two, agriculture has been challenged by the drought, the issue of El Nino, which has impacted productivity this year. But next year we expect a far better crop. But there's some crops that have done reasonably okay, such as the tobacco sector, for example, which is our largest export sector. And of course, agriculture is important in the sense that most of our people live on the land. So we're keen to make sure that this sector is supported, and we're doing that as government. In terms of the mining sector, this is a roaring sector, frankly, in the sense that the investors are not deterred by any of the negativity. They are investing. We're determined to create a $12 billion industry over the next 3 years or so. And we've got opportunities in the gold sector, in the platinum sector, in the other sectors such as diamonds, for example, with the ferrochrome sector, with the coal sector. Zimbabwe is easily the top 40 valuable minerals in the world, and they are very easy to mine. So we're very bullish about the sector being a key driver of the economic recovery.
Economic recovery, though, is not really possible if there are issues, particularly when it comes to power challenges. We're reading reports that sometimes up to 18 hours will go by in a day in Zimbabwe where there's no power.
Yes, the absence of power, of energy, is an issue for productivity and for everyone in the country. But the real cause of this has been the drought, which has reduced the water levels for hydropower production at Kariba Dam. So that's really the issue. So we have to wait for the next rainy season for that water to come up. But for the moment, we are importing power from South Africa, from Mozambique, and Zambia in the near future. But clearly we need to deal with the power issue. For the moment, we're plugging with importation of power. But we're also accelerating investment in the solar energy sector, making sure that there's investment in solar farms, which that power then is put onto the grid, and we are improving that. But also individual households, those who can afford it, of course, are investing in solar power in their homes to make sure that they are never out of power. But for companies that then have to use diesel generators or petrol generators, then becomes very expensive power indeed. But we are dealing with the power sector.
Okay. When you speak about economic recovery, we know that fiscal deficit is estimated to be about 10.7% of GDP. What factors led to that, and then what fiscal consolidation measures are you as Zimbabwe trying to put into place?
Yes, indeed. In 2018, the fiscal deficit was double digit, just above 10% to GDP. But that's the past now. Things have changed. Since January to the last 8 months, we've run a surplus every month. So there's been very strong fiscal consolidation measures under the theme of austerity for prosperity, which really is targeted at government to make sure that we can live within our means. We're doing that. We've right-sized the civil service. We've cut down on government waste, but also we've expanded the tax net by introducing an electronic transactions tax of 2%, but also we're more tax efficient in our behavior as Zimbabweans in terms of collecting those taxes. Our equivalent of SARS or ZIMRA is very effective at collecting taxes. So that has assisted us with the fiscal consolidation. We've also shut down the use of the borrowing window at the central bank, the overdraft window as government. And we're not borrowing anymore because we have enough resources as government to finance government programs, and they've converted the overdraft facility into long-term dated instrument, which is also very good because then we can develop a bond market going forward. So things have gone very well on the fiscal consolidation front.
When you say things have gone very well, there's still a lot of challenges on the ground that citizens in Zimbabwe complain about. I know the fuel shortages and the access to things like that is still a major complaint. When are citizens going to feel the effects of consolidation, of an economic recovery and the like on the ground?
The issue of fuel shortage, of currency issues and inflation issues are a monetary sector phenomenon, in the sense that at the end of the day, all inflation is nothing other than a monetary factor. So again, we're making progress on that, in the sense that we introduced a new currency, a domestic currency, which is the sole legal tender within the Zimbabwe dollar, US dollar, and other currencies are foreign currency, and that's what it should be. In any country, it should be like that. You should be able to come into a country, if you want to buy anything from shops, you convert to domestic currency if you're carrying a foreign currency. We've done that, and introduced an interbank market. We have a floating exchange rate, and what that will do in the end is make sure that the foreign currency is available for fuel importation, for us to also build reserve over time. We're also going to build reserve to support the currency over time. So the monetary system is being reformed and has been reformed to deal with those challenges that pertain to foreign currency and the fuel challenges in terms of supply.
And then the trickling down of that and the effects, do you have a timeline where you say by X amount of time these challenges should be resolved, and it'll be easier for day-to-day functioning to work?
So basically all the major macroeconomic decisions for our economic reform agenda will be completed during 2019. In 2020, we'll focus on the productive sector, on manufacturing, supporting agriculture, mining, tourism, investment infrastructure to create jobs. We're working on that just to switch completely from the macro to the micro. So that will be our focus 2020 going forward towards 2023 and then 2030. But of course, the response of the economy usually takes longer. There's often an 18-month lag in terms of economic response to a certain economic policy. So citizens should be patient. We're on a reform agenda. The economy is in transition. We will get there.
When you raise the issue of jobs, about 36% of people in Zimbabwe are young people, and there's a challenge, like in most parts of sub-Saharan Africa, of getting those people employed. How does coming to WIF and having the agenda around the fourth industrial revolution give you as Zimbabwe ideas in order to create new ways of working, perhaps that haven't been thought of in the traditional industries that we've spoken about?
You're right. The opportunity of the fourth industrial revolution really requires us to think differently, outside the box, if not throw away the box, in fact. So using ICT as a way of plugging with the workplace is really the way to go. Capacitating the young people to drive a knowledge-based economy that is based on ICT. And those who are good at coding, they're really good at coding, and we have lots of Zimbabweans who are good. So it's a matter of supporting their ideas in launching different technologies in the ICT space. So through incubators, through entrepreneurship support, through mentoring programs, as well as venture funds for investment in their ideas. So we're looking into that. So making sure that they're not just looking for jobs, they're not just job ready, but also they're entrepreneurship ready, and we support their ideas. That's what we're going to take away from this WEF.
If we're talking about implementing that kind of knowledge and what you're going to take back to WIF, another one of the challenges when we speak about power is the telecommunications industry in Zimbabwe, facing particular challenges now related to that power supply. So how have you been dealing with that?
Oh, the Zimbabwe telecom sector is very innovative. So, for example, I know that some of the companies are now, powering their base stations and other infrastructure using, batteries, for example, from companies such as Tesla. They're also using solar power to power different and various types of infrastructure within their industry. So they're very innovative, and they're moving forward. You will not be surprised even to hear that Zimbabwe is going to, incentivize the usage of electric cars beyond telecoms. Because why? Because we want to deal with the energy issue, and we know that we have a challenge in the supply of electricity as well as petrol and diesel.
Mm-hmm. We know that we're at WIF now, but we're not insulated completely from what's happening outside of these halls in this forum. If we look to our right, there are protests that are taking place. We know that Zimbabwe has also seen protests from the opposition leaders. So let's start talking about what's happening in South Africa, and then we'll move to Zimbabwe. There have been Afrophobic or xenophobic attacks that have taken place. What is your response to that? And have you had any communications with your peers in South Africa around what's happening there?
Well, of course. I mean, I guess two things. One is that maybe South Africa should be more embracing to its brothers and sisters in the rest of the continent. We're one Africa. We have an Africa continental free trade area that we're all aspiring to make work and create one market. So in that spirit, we should all embrace each other. But secondly, we're aware that the authorities have said there's a lot of criminality, and that criminality should be dealt with through the rule of law, and I'm certain that the authorities will deal with it.
Mm-hmm. And then when it comes to the protests in Zimbabwe, we saw particularly about 2 weeks ago them flaring up over government policies and alleged human rights violation and the like. How do you deal with that in a manner that is democratic, constitutional, and ensures that everyone is involved in what happens in your country and making their voice heard without being challenged in a way that's unfair or illegal?
Zimbabwe is a democratic country, and the right to protest is allowed, but there is a process to the right to protest, and which is governed by the rule of law. And obviously, in situations where it is deemed that it is not within the law, then the law takes its course and so forth. The government has never acted outside the law. law-abiding citizens. So, but at the same time, there's a right to protest. Zimbabwe is a democratic country. And in fact, what you see in Zimbabwe is an expression of that democracy. It's very noisy, but that's what democracy means. I mean, I sit in parliament sometimes and we think we're all crazy. The noise, the heckling, the finger pointing, but that's what democracy means, and we fully embrace that.
This is where we leave it tonight. We're back with you again next week. Remember, you can write to us at tvbusiness@sabc.co.za. Your views will be appreciated. And remember, Economics Unbound will come to you every Thursday between 9 and 10 p.m. We're back with you next week. It's goodbye from us.
Now, that was an interesting discussion about how large infrastructure projects can crowd in investment, how Zimbabwe can regenerate its economy, issues of democracy and human rights. That is where we have to leave it tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. Cheerio. Good night.